Good morning, CHD. Welcome to Pediatric Perspectives, where we're taking a look at children's health challenges from a different perspective, one that includes critical thinking and not afraid to give you the honest truth. My guest today is Dr. Pierre Kory. Welcome, Dr. Kory. It's so great to have you on Pediatric Perspectives.
Great to be here, Paul. It's good to see you again.
For those of you who may not know Dr. Kory, I think a lot of our audience does, but there's always new people. You're one of my heroes, and I say that because there's just a handful of doctors who responded to the COVID crisis in a very powerful, ethical, honest way, and you're one of them. You are a board-certified specialist in pulmonary medicine, internal medicine, and critical care.
My new title is NLBC, no longer board certified. I have to update that bio.
I'm in the same category. I was board-certified for 30 years, and when they emergently suspended my license because I think it was because I published data, vax and unvax data, I am no longer board certified. So now I've got the right designation for what my status is.
Yeah.
I want to point out to listeners that critical care medicine, and you did so much, you're a world leader in ultrasound, there's just so much you've done, but critical care medicine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I remember doing my rotations and you are dealing with life and death, the sickest of the sickest who need, support of multiple organ systems. And there's nobody who's saving lives like a critical care medicine person. And so I have the utmost respect for your specialty in that area, especially when it came to what happened with COVID, because you were on the front lines, right? Yeah. And as a critical care doctor, you're trying to go, okay, how do I save this patient? And when we first were seeing COVID, when it first hit, we didn't even know what we were dealing with.
Nope.
And you very quickly figured it out.
Yeah.
And thank you for that. Actually, I'm just curious, what were some of the key things that allowed you to figure it out?
Well, interestingly, so I'll give you one sort of anecdote. Do you remember the term happy hypoxia that was circulating when COVID first broke out, right?
Yeah.
Because it was mystifying doctors because patients were coming in with low oxygen levels, but they didn't have elevated work of breathing, right? They were tolerated really well. Their SATs were in the 80s. And, everyone started saying, what is this strange new disease and whatnot? And I remember being mystified too. And I swear, I'll tell you really granularly. I remember one day I was getting ready to go to the ICU. I was in the shower and I was thinking about these patients. And then literally a light bulb went off in my head. I said, you know what I think they have? I said, I think they have organizing pneumonia, which is BOOP, right? Remember the old phrase BOOP, bronchiolitis obliterans organizing pneumonia? That's the old term. Now it's just called organizing pneumonia. And the reason why I thought of that, because I kept thinking, I was like, I know I've seen patients with really low oxygen levels who look comfortable. And I was trying to figure out what setting did I see that in? And then it clicked. I remember it was someone with organized pneumonia. Organized pneumonia, most commonly, there's the idiopathic form, but what I used to see was it's like a drug toxicity effect. So like amiodarone can do it. Chemotherapy agents can do it, like bleomycin can do it. And I remembered it just clicked in the shower. I was like, oh yeah, now I remember that guy. He had amiodarone toxicity.
Huh.
And luckily at the time I was at the University of Wisconsin, and the guy there is literally probably the best chest radiologist in the country. He sits on all the committees from the American Society of Radiology. And he was close to me because he was the chest radiologist. So I'd always go to him with difficult cases. I immediately called him up and I said, Jeff, what would you say if I told you that I think all of these patients have organizing pneumonia? That's what COVID pneumonia was. It's an organizing pneumonia for which you need steroids. To go back to your question, like how did I start figuring out? The steroid aspect came that way, where I was like, this is organized pneumonia, and the gold standard first line therapy is steroids.
Inhaled or oral or IV?
No, well in an ICU you'd probably give it a IV. If they were mild outpatient, you'd give it orally. But once they're in the ICU, we would give it IV. And you won't believe what he said to me, Paul. He goes, of course we know that. We wrote about this in February of 2020 because he was part of a committee of radiologists that reviewed all of the CAT scans from China, and he published their report their review of all the CAT scans in a radiology journal in February. I was calling him in April. I was in New York City running my old ICU. And I just started shouting. I was like, nobody reads radiology journals. Like,
Right.
No one's going to find that. And then I pulled this paper, and they right there in like the first line of the report, it said the predominant form of lung injury in COVID is an organizing pneumonia pattern. And so that was kind of like a breakthrough. And I immediately said, I said, Jeff, we got to write this up and get this into a medical journal, like a pulmonary journal or a general medical journal. And then that took me 5 months to publish. I finally published it in the British Medical Journal Respiratory Reviews. But I got rejected from a few journals. And I remember I got rejected from Chest, which is one of the preeminent journals in my specialty. One reviewer loved the paper. I put all of the evidence showing, using clinical reasoning, by the way, Paul, right? No evidence. We didn't really have biopsies, although we had a little bit of biopsies, which gave clues. And we had some autopsies. But the problem with autopsies is they were dying of ARDS. The lung is destroyed at that time. So you're not catching that early phase organizing pneumonia. You're catching like an end stage lung injury. And so I didn't have like really great pathological evidence, but I had plenty of stuff, the radiology and everything.
You've published over 50 peer-reviewed papers, and you're having a hard time getting this published.
Yeah, this one, because it was a hypothesis paper, right? Because I was saying, I think the title was COVID-19 organizing pneumonia. What was it was something like, how come we haven't made this diagnosis, or, it was sort of like a question, like, could this all be an organizing pneumonia? That was kind of the title of my paper. And I remember Chest, one reviewer loved the paper, wanted to accept it. The other reviewer said, this paper cannot be published until a randomized controlled trial of corticosteroids.
Oh my goodness. That actually is phenomenal. I wished I had stumbled on that fact in those papers back then. I think a lot of us missed that, right? So then you went on. I mean, you've published, you've done 17 book chapters. You've been senior editor of award-winning textbook. You went on to then write The War on Ivermectin, and you're the co-founder and president emeritus of Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, which FLCCC. Folks, if you aren't aware of the resources at FLCCC, you need to know about it, right? You still have all these protocols for free.
Yeah. I left that organization, but all our work is still there. Paul's work on cancer is still there. And so, that's still good, solid, relevant information.
Yeah. I remember reading The War on Ivermectin and just going, wow, I had missed the ivermectin thing, I think, until I read your book.
Wow.
So you figured out the organizing pneumonia piece and the need for steroids. And then how did you stumble on ivermectin?
That was much later, actually. What we were doing, and Paul was in the lead, my partner, Paul Marek, who I co-founded the FLCCC with, we were constantly reading, studying everything, preprints, publications, talking to doctors around the world. And we'd heard kind of smatterings or murmurings of ivermectin being helpful or would work. And so Paul had almost like this scoreboard where we had all of these therapies, and he would change the therapy from like green, yellow to red, like do not use, possibly might help, definitely should help. And ivermectin was on that chart, but it was at the bottom. There was a question mark, and it was in white because we had nothing to go on it. But we were tracking all therapeutics. And then in October of 2020, 3 papers came out in succession. One came out of Miami in Chest, one of the top journals in the world. It was an observational study, and they showed a 70% reduction in mortality in patients who got ivermectin in the hospital. Wow. And it was well done. And I know the authors, they had a dickens of a time trying to publish that. But it was that, and then there was stuff coming out of like Bangladesh and a couple other places. And then the papers just kept flying out from all of these countries around the world, right? But as you know, Paul, the studies are low quality. They're not controlled. They're not, all the evidence-based medicine blatherings that the authorities will just pull out, right? Because they do not want cheap off-patent drugs. But the evidence is just accumulating so widely. And so as soon as I saw that, Paul picked up on it. I started to write a review paper, and I spent, weeks and weeks, nights and weekends, and it was a really hard paper to write because literally as I was finishing my draft, another study would pop up on the radar. And I had a bad reference manager. So I had to manually change. It was 130 references in the paper. So
that is such hard work.
you get it. You get it. So anyway, but yeah, that was ivermectin. But just to finish on another, when you said, how did you figure stuff out? We already knew, in our first, because the thing is, we came up with a hospital protocol, ICU protocol first. We didn't have an early treatment protocol until ivermectin. Then we had ivermectin. Then we had second and third line. We had a really mature outpatient protocol, but that didn't happen until October of 2020. Originally in April, we had a protocol for the hospital. The blood thinners was such a no-brainer, Paul. I'd go into the ICU. We'd have all these patients. They're developing. The first wave was wicked. We saw a lot of kidney failure. So patients were landing on dialysis. And you could see the dialysis circuits. You could see clots forming in them. The dialysis nurses were like, whoa, these patients are clotting like crazy. And we were doing some clotting studies using a kind of a sophisticated thing. It's called a TEG, thromboelastography. And they had these wicked patterns of no fibrinolysis, massive rapid clotting. And so I wanted to use blood thinners, but I'm just going to finish this chapter here. That caused me to resign from my position because my chief and my chair started coming to our clinical briefings every day, which I was running, and because they didn't like what I was doing, because I was literally, wait for it, suggesting that we try things
that are working.
Steroids. Let's do blood thinners, and they were like, there's no randomized controlled trials for this, supportive care only. And I just said, I'm done. I will refuse to be a clinical leader if you guys are going to do supportive care, because I could see what that was having patients. None were getting better. They were getting hung up on ventilators and then slowly deteriorating back. I mean, that's what happens when you don't treat a disease, and this idea that this viral syndrome is just self-limited and the body can fight it off. Yeah, for most viruses, once you're in the ICU, you're past that. You need a lot of help to come back. So anyway, I'll just stop there. But I mean, some of it was just so plain, simple, good clinical intuition and prudence and judgment. You can figure out how to treat these patients.
I remember, I think you either shared this with me or I read it somewhere, but your success rate of saving people in the ICU was pretty high.
Well, here's where I want to be really honest about that. That was the success rate of Joe and Paul. And I'll tell you why mine wasn't that high. I was putting out all the stops. I was using the same protocols. It's a big difference. The patients that were coming to me, I couldn't treat them prior to the ICU. And it was really difficult to start treatment and turn someone around in the ICU. Whereas in Paul's hospital, that patient was on their service from the ER. So Paul was putting them on the protocol in the ER. In Joe Verone's hospital, he was putting them on as soon as they came in and were sick enough to be admitted, they went on the whole protocol. Whereas me, they would come in, go to a hospital ward, be there for a week, not be treated, lungs deteriorating and damaging, and then they'd land on a ventilator and come to me, and then I'd throw everything at them, but I did not have that kind of success. Remember, early treatment is key. In every disease we know, early treatment is what's critical. And so late treatment, I did not have the success that they did.
Yeah. Thank you for making that clear. And I think that applies to anything that comes at us in the future. We need to jump on to early treatment, and there's lots of options there. We can talk about that maybe later. Before I leave your amazing book, The War on Ivermectin, which is still something I think folks should read because it's not just the history of what happened. You've got everything in there. I really enjoyed reading. It was just, I underline everything I read. So I went through your book second time yesterday knowing we were going to talk, and I was hit with the counterfeit trials distorting ivermectin's efficacy, counterfeit science. I went through the same problem. We've gone through the same issue with vaccines as what happened with ivermectin. And people need to understand that the mainstream and the journals are compromised.
That is, Paul, you've lived through this. I lived through this. And actually, I have a question for you. So I'm first going to answer your question, then I have a question. But
okay.
What inspired that book was after we found out that ivermectin worked, I was kicking butt treating patients early. They were turning around quickly. I mean, this was an amazingly effective drug, especially early on. In later variants, not as impressive, but I mean, early on, it was just wicked. And I gave the ivermectin testimony in the Senate, and it went viral. So there's a lot of attention around ivermectin. And then my life started going sideways. Like, I couldn't figure out. I lost my I resigned my first job. I lost my second job because they didn't want me speaking publicly. My paper, which passed peer review, suddenly got retracted by some anonymous third-party reviewer after I passed 4 scientists who peer reviewed my paper. They wouldn't publish it. There was hit jobs in the media on me, on Paul. Like, I couldn't figure out what was going on in the world. And then the story that I always tell is that it was in March of 2021. I got an email from a guy I didn't know. It was Professor William B. Grant. He wrote to me, he said, "Dear Dr. Kory, what they're doing to ivermectin, they've been doing to vitamin D for decades." And he's like one of the world's published researchers on vitamin D. Mm-hmm. And he sent me a link to an article called the Disinformation Playbook. And I click on the link, I read the article. It's very well laid out, graphically easy to read. They give concrete examples of when disinformation is being practiced by industries, right? When science emerges that's inconvenient to their interests. So to your point, right, Paul, you had a front row seat to the vaccine disinformation campaign that the vaccine manufacturers do, right? They control the journals, they control the studies, they manipulate studies. Yep. And when I read that article, I was like, suddenly the world made sense, because I couldn't figure out why. I wasn't expecting a ticker tape parade, but I got nothing but attacks and dismissals and not considerations. And like, even I got presented before the NIH, and they were behaving very oddly, and like nobody was making sense. And then I realized this is the playbook. And so when we talk about those plays, you saw it front row seat in the vaccine thing. I saw it in ivermectin. But my question to you is that what led you to learn all the manipulations they do with published evidence, or did you have some inkling of that before you started to like research and try to publish on vaccines?
No, honestly, for me, I was learning about the challenges with vaccines, and I needed to figure out why my patients weren't doing well. Why were kids regressing into autism? Why were we seeing this massive increase in all sorts of developmental issues, ADD, ADHD, allergies, asthma, et cetera? There was no good explanation, right? And all the articles would always say, and it's not the vaccines, that's been proven. It just didn't make any sense, because I'd read nothing that compared unvaccinated to vaccinated, for example. So I thought, all right, well, I've got enough data here within my own patient practice. In 2015, I said, all right, here's an article. I wrote up a beautiful paper with the results from my practice, so real world data. Yep. I couldn't get it published. And, I just didn't have the clout. And at that point, I didn't realize what I now realize that you were just talking about, this counterfeit science that they publish, and the fact that they'll publish bogus studies that show nothing, right? Negative results. Yep. But that they block publication, and then the retraction of positive results, that happened to me just like as it happened to you. In 2019, the medical board was already after me, and they said, prove that your vaccine-friendly plan is as safe as the CDC schedule. And I basically went about doing that, got every patient born into my practice over a 10.5-year period, and we looked at all health outcomes comparing unvaxxed to vaccinated, published it, went through peer review. It was online and published for 6 months, 250,000 downloads, and it was retracted based on one bogus complaint.
Yep. See, that's me. It never even made it to publication. They stopped it before it could get published. And,
right.
And when it got retracted, it was because I was writing to the journal. This is during the biggest wave of deaths in COVID. It was that winter of 2020, 2021. Right. And the paper was accepted, and week after week got by. They weren't sending me the proofs, or the copy edits or anything. And it was an online journal. I had paid $2,000, or my organization did, to have it open access. The world needed to hear this. And finally, I was fed up, and I wrote to the journal representative, and I said, I suspect scientific misconduct, and I'm going to go public with this. And next day, the chief editor of all the journals, it was the Frontiers journals, called the special editor of my issue, which was Robert Malone. He's the one who came up with the idea to have an issue on efficacy of repurposed drugs in COVID. And basically, the editor told Robert that there was a complaint on the paper, and they hired some third-party anonymous reviewer who didn't send me their peer review. and that they said my data doesn't support the conclusions, and they're retracted, and didn't give me a chance to revise or anything. And the fix was in, and so like that was slowly realizing all the stuff we're talking about. But going back to this disinformation playbook, right? It's named after 5 tactics they use, all named by football plays, right? The fake, the fix, the diversion, the screen, the blitz. And all of those things, like when I read the article, I had at least 3 to 5 examples of each play that was being done against ivermectin. And so that's why I felt like I had the teacher's edition to the world. I'm like, this is what's happening. Ivermectin there's a war against ivermectin, this disinformation campaign.
Yeah.
And they manipulate everything. They control the journals, the media, the agencies, and particularly the journals. And it's like what you said. I was, after I came out and I was kind of public about my expertise on ivermectin, I was getting emails from researchers all over the world with positive trials they could not publish. Rejection from anything remotely high impact. You could publish in tertiary journals, but that's already almost dismissed, low quality, whatever. And so like they couldn't publish positive results. At the same time, these fraudulently manipulated trials done by the highest academic medical centers in the world, brazenly manipulating those trials to show a negative result. And that was the scary part. I was like, wow, this goes deep. Me and my colleagues were looking at these studies and we could see what they were doing. I mean, it was so brazen, but they would fly to publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of the American Medical Association, and then they would get published. And you saw these PR campaigns going out in the newspapers and TV, ivermectin found ineffective in COVID, latest high quality, rigorous trial says, you know what I'm saying? It's like, and it's the same thing. Vaccines don't cause autism, latest high quality, rigorous. And then when you look at the trial, you're like, oh my gosh,
right. total garbage science and then absolute manipulation or lies.
The fix is where they manipulate government officials. The blitz is where they harass the researchers who are bringing forth that inconvenient science. And so you got blitzed, I got blitzed, right? I lost my boards, you lost your license. I mean, this has been going on 100 years, by the way. I mean, well, technically the disinformation playbook was put together by the tobacco industry in the 1950s to counter the studies coming out linking cigarettes to cancer. Right. And they perfected it. But then pharma is like the most skilled practitioner of disinformation. And pharma is just so huge. They have so much money. They own the media, right? They're the biggest advertiser. They're the biggest lobbyist. I mean, it's just, I call this the United States of pharma, and people don't understand that we're being manipulated by the pharmaceutical industry into really bad medicine. And the good stuff, the cheap, available, natural, that's always been suppressed.
What's the solution? I mean, you've been living this now and you're cutting edge. What do we need to do? What are we doing?
I mean, I do the only thing I can, which is educate. That's what I was. I mean, that was my career, and I continue to educate. That book was the inspiration. Was I have to teach people about what's happening. I figure if you can arm people with a keen eye, understanding what propaganda is, how it's practiced, and unfortunately, the conclusion of the book is really one of you cannot trust officialdom. I mean, those are all very captured entities, especially the journals are captured. They can't. That's
a tough one for our peers, right? I mean, we're so indoctrinated to follow the science, and yet what we're presented is junk science.
Before COVID, Paul, I literally had so much respect for the New England Journal of Medicine. When a trial was published in New England Journal of Medicine, it's the scientists who published that study and did that study and the front page of New England. I mean, it's almost like the Yankees hitting a home run. Like you're supposed to venerate that. And now I wouldn't even look at one of those journals. I know what they are. Whatever you're reading is clearly manipulated and or false. And then you read about all of these editors of those high impact journals who literally left their positions, like Marcia Engel, after 20 years as that editor, to write a book about how most published research findings are false. They're manipulating the studies. And so there's been warning cries for decades. Like, I'm not the guy who figured this out. I mean, Marcia Engel wrote her book in 2001.
Yeah.
And so.
And it's just become more and more aggressive.
Yes.
I'm with you. I can't listen to the news unless I just want to get the weather.
Yeah.
JAMA is another one, Journal of American Medical Association. I mean, I get it online every day or every week, and I peruse it. It's almost all garbage.
Yeah. And even if there's something of interest, if it has to do with money, if it's a profitable patented product, I'm not going to believe it. I can't. My cynicism, skepticism knows no bounds. I mean, they do this routinely. I mean, look at how many dangerous drugs that don't work that they foisted. I mean, look at remdesivir. Look at Vioxx. Look at this Aduhelm for Alzheimer's. I mean, these are insane things that they're doing, and it goes unnoticed by the wider public. And doctors are very trusting for some reason still. And I don't know how to stop it. And then the media with the measles thing. I mean, one of the things I said, I was being asked questions about this, and they said, how can we, stop the media from, manipulating us like with the scaremongering for measles, right? They're just trying to scare everyone into getting vaccinated. And I said, you know what? I said, we don't have to do anything. Let them keep doing what they're doing because they're losing trust rapidly. Trust in physicians and hospitals has plummeted since before COVID from 71% to 40%. Trust in the media. In this survey over 20 years, there's 3 survey responses. Do you have a lot of trust, some trust, or no trust? For the first time in history, last year or earlier this year, late last year, the amount of people with no trust in the media now exceeds the other categories. So they're doing a bang-up job of doing what I'm trying to do, which is teach people to not listen to the media. I said, let them keep doing this. People are seeing through this. And the work with CHD and really showing the truth about these measles cases, which I was honored to be a part of as the expert reviewer.
Right.
I think that's what it is. Just keep putting out truths, credibility. We're conflict of interest free. I don't make money off of my opinions, and nor do I seek to. And so I think that's part of the answer. Let's stay the course with integrity, conviction, expertise, and deep study, and just keep putting out good information.
Yes. You have a phenomenal interview that's up on CHD about measles, but since we mentioned it, I want to just have you comment on a couple things. So in my experience and having reviewed the measles data that's available, there really hadn't been any deaths from measles in the last 15, 20 years, something like that. I mean, there was a death of a person in Washington who I reviewed it, and it turned out they were end stage multi-organ system failure. They found measles in autopsy. I mean, this person did not have measles. These last 2 cases, which they're going to be up now for the world who don't know what we know, people are going to think, oh, there have been 2 deaths now from measles in the US. You did a deep dive into them. Can you just in a couple, 2-3 minutes, summarize what you found? Because I think you got access to the medical records, right?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time reviewing it. One case was easier because it was a short admission and pretty straightforward. The other one was much more extensive. But in the case of these 2 girls, yes, they had measles, but so what? It had nothing to do with their deaths. You can die with measles and not from measles, but yet it's being manipulated that as measles killed them. Measles, as we know, is a really benign illness. It's very rare to cause death. Death is like 1 in 10,000. Some complications can happen to 5%. Almost all of them are easily treatable. And in these 2 cases, the complications, well, in one case, it was clear that she had a secondary bacterial pneumonia after measles, which can happen again with any virus. I have 3 daughters. One of them had a secondary bacterial pneumonia from the flu when she was 14. She got better in 2 days on an appropriate antibiotic. And in that first child's case, she clearly had a secondary bacterial pneumonia. They diagnosed it correctly. They put her on antibiotics, but they put her on an asinine, ridiculous regimen, which didn't cover mycoplasma, which is one of the most common community-acquired pneumonia organisms. They didn't recognize it until literally a day before her death. And by the time they started azithromycin, which standard of care would have dictated they should have started in the ER, she was already deteriorating and dying. And that is clear malpractice to me. They deviated from the standard of care. And in the second case, hers was much more complicated. She'd been sick for a month before she got measles. She had mono, she had strep, she had a pneumonia. And then after being treated in the hospital for pneumonia, she was sent home without oral antibiotics. So that she crashes into an ICU 2 days later with measles, but with the same pneumonia that she had, which is getting worse. She gets better from the measles. So she's discharged from the ICU, rash is clearing, pneumonia's getting better, oxygen is better. She goes home. The parents didn't want to send her home because they thought she didn't look good. But they sent her home anyway. And it turns out she came back and she ended up dying, which they didn't recognize until after death. She ended up dying of a horrific E. coli organism, which was highly drug resistant, which she caught in her first ICU stay. And they actually stopped antibiotics on day one in that last ICU because they said it was measles. And I had to watch this day after day of this child deteriorating, and they're writing that this is measles pneumonia, sequelae of measles, sequelae of measles. And then finally around day 4, she had an 8-day hospitalization. Finally, they're like, well, maybe we should restart antibiotics. And like day 6 or 5 is the first time in the chart that I see someone saying, possibility of a hospital-acquired infection. And then she ends up dying on day 8. The antibiotics they put her on were resistant to that bug. And on day 8, the culture comes back 4+ growth, which is massive amount of growth.
Massive growth.
That's purulence coming out of an ET tube. And it shows an E. coli, which was resistant to almost everything. There's only a couple of antibiotics or 3 antibiotics that was sensitive. So those cases were not measles, period. It's just really poor doctoring and mismanagement.
Yeah. I learned, I don't know if this is held true, but Dr. Suzanne Humphreys also reviewed that second case in very depth. And the measles diagnosis was based on PCR and a positive IgG, but there wasn't evidence of positive IgM against measles. So it might not be
typical rash, but there was a rash which did come on and then it cleared. But again, from the evidence that was not a measles pneumonia.
That child did not die from measles. That's for sure.
Not at all.
Wow. Well, I'm a little nervous about measles being used right now to kind of do the same thing they did with COVID, which was once you get into a hospital setting, all the focus is measles. They're not managing it appropriately because of that.
Yep.
And so your risk of dying is greater if you get in the hospital. I mean, I remember in my practice, I've only had 1 case of measles in 35 years. And it was a year that measles came through the community of the greater Portland, Oregon area. And yes, I had a number of unvaccinated patients. And in this case, it was an unvaccinated kid. They never came into the office even. I mean, I saw pictures. She was pretty sick, but she did fine. It feels to me like we need to keep kids out of the hospital, manage them appropriately outpatient. And where should people go? You have a clinic. Is this something your clinic might manage, or what would you suggest?
I do telehealth. I mean, we could always see a measles kid, and I have some pretty simple solutions that I would recommend. But like you said, Paul, it's a benign illness for almost everybody. I mean, we all had measles as a kid, right? I mean, you look back, there's that famous Brady Bunch episode where they're almost having a joke with measles. Like the kids are cheering that they have measles because they get to stay out of school for a few days. Like nobody was scared of it. And so I think in most cases it's benign and self-limited. I think really the main thing is you just want to make sure you're being mindful of complications. And you're right, that part about they got keyed in. That's what happened in that second case. They got so focused on the measles, they just ran to that diagnosis without considering other things. And it's this obsession with measles. It's harmful.
I agree. I think, and you mentioned it earlier in our interview, vitamin D status is important.
Yep.
We need to be supplementing vitamin D, vitamin C. Most humans don't make their own vitamin C like most animals. We need vitamin C. And then in the case of measles, vitamin A, I mean, we don't make treatment recommendations here on this show, but these are things you need to consider because if you optimize your status for those things, and vitamin A is the only one where you can actually get toxic if you take too much. So you need to be careful on the dose of that. Work with your provider on that. But yeah, if you're worried about measles or there's measles in your community, make sure you've optimized your vitamin status, your nutritional status. Get your body healthy and ready to go. What keeps you up at night? We need to wrap this one up. What keeps you up at night, and what's your hope for the future?
I don't know that I'm troubled anymore. I'm so focused on my work. I write for my Substack, and I'm researching all sorts of interesting therapies that are repurposed, cheap, safe, and available. And they're so inspiring. I mean, there's certain things I've been writing about that just really hold out so much hope for people therapeutically. Some things they can access themselves. And so I like the idea that I'm working on empowering people to protect their health more. I always like to remind everything, I am not a wellness doctor. I treat illness. I just want to tell you, like, you have people like longevity doctors do this for your health. Like, that's not me. Come to me when you're sick. I'm really good at treating sick people, and that's what I like to do. But I have all these therapies that I'm learning and employing in my practice. And then my hope, I'll just go to Bobby in HHS. I mean, he's the right guy for that job. I know he's in a tough spot, but I know his vision and what he wants to do, and he has authority to do it. And I'm really looking forward to what he can accomplish over the next 4 years.
I share that hope with you. How can people get a hold of you? And folks, you need to get Dr. Kory's Substack.
It's a long word, but it's Pierre Kory, medicalmusings.com. And then my clinic, we do telehealth. We see patients all 50 states. That's Leading Edge Clinic, or drpierrekory.com.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Kory. We'll definitely get you back on.
Definitely.
Well, folks, thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you next week. You can reach me at kidsfirstforever.com. And my new book, Vax Facts, is a must read if you have any questions at all about vaccines, or if you're considering doing vaccines. Be informed. Get the book, Vax Facts. You can get that at vaxfactsbook.com or anywhere books are sold. We'll see you next week.
I'm Juliana Pierce, and I am the autism advocate for California, and this is my son Nathan, and we are here because vaccine injury is real, and we found out the hard way. In the year 2000, he had missed his shots on schedule because I was pregnant with my fourth child, and I was unable to keep up with the schedule. And 2 weeks before my daughter was born, we went into the pediatrician's office.
And you're that daughter?
No.
My younger sister.
She was here earlier.
She's not here tonight.
She left earlier. And so we go to the pediatrician's office, and she notices that Nathan's not up to date. And she said, well, why don't we just catch him up, because you're going to be busy with your new baby. And so he got his 12-month, 15-month, 18-month, and 24-month vaccines in one day. At 23 months.
So how many vaccines did he actually
Probably
have?
about 9 different ones, including the Hep A and the Hep B together.
That is absolutely diabolical.
I questioned
Do you think, Josh?
Yeah.
I questioned it. I said,
That's okay? No.
it's not okay.
There's nothing that's okay with that whatsoever.
And I do believe the Hep A was not really given as much back then, but I questioned, why are they mixing the Hep A and the Hep B together? And she said it's perfectly fine, and you're going to be busy with the new baby, just do it. Well, that day was the worst day of my life, because that's the day we lost Nathan.
That's okay. That's okay.
And he almost died.
Yep.
He almost died from those vaccines.
I was still very young when it happened. I think it was something like 2.5 years old, roughly. But when Nathan came home that day, he was not at all the same as when he left. And I remember he didn't actually properly speak. It was all echolalia until he was about 8 years old, when he finally said his first sentence. And it was after injury, of course. It was just he was such an incredibly smart baby, so incredibly smart, and nothing was ever really quite the same after he got that many vaccinations, which of course we found out a few weeks later that they had been recalled at least 2.5 weeks before he received them. And
MR was recalled.
And of course, my mom here, she's a nurse. She's a trained nurse. She's been told throughout all of her training there's nothing wrong with the vaccines. They're perfectly safe. They're relatively new and untested, but as far as we know, they are safe. And her doctor even told her flat out when she had questioned it that they were safe, and they were not. And we ended up with a child who was incredibly blessed, but never quite the same.
He's maintain that the siblings, I feel, have it hardest of all. Siblings and the grandparents, because they watch, you watch your mother in pain, and you watch your brother in pain.
Yeah.
And so you have double whammy. And so we have a lot of respect and love for you.
Thank you.
So, yeah, you're going to go and see Balsy, and you are an amazing autism mother. I know you.
I know. I love you too, Polly.
I'm pretending I don't, but
I know.
do.
We're buds.
She is, if you don't know her, find her on Facebook because she writes great things and you're entertaining as well as informative. And I'm really grateful to you and the work you do because it helps us a lot.
Yeah.
And your son is amazing.
Yeah. Vaccine injury is real.
Now, can you write your name?
Yes. I would love to.
Would you like to write your name on the bus?
Yes. Can I do it between the A and the X?
You can do it whatever you like.